Thank you. I know he's got my slides, and I hope they're going to appear. Well, I'm going to present some possibly overlapping, but perhaps in some ways more jolly and in some ways less happy views about, among other things, Christianity. I begin with a quote from Nietzsche, whom I appreciate, as does Jordan. And what I'm going to be talking about, in effect, is the idea that when we think about meaning, what determines our attitudes to a number of fundamental choices is what I call temperament. Now, there are many theories of personality and theories of temperament. I'm not thinking about any of these particular theories. As you'll see, my conception of temperament is essentially negative. It just means that if it's a condition that is based on temperament, it means that it's unlikely to be ruled by reason. And I'm going to focus on three of what I call existential questions, the answers to which distribute themselves into a set which I will call the heavy set, and a set that I will call the light set. This is under the inspiration of, indirectly of Nietzsche, but directly from Kundera's discussion of light and heavy in his wonderful novel, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. The three categories of questions in question are going to be our attitude to time, the necessity or not of transcendence, the value of suffering. And then finally, I will make a few remarks about how this conception bears on issues about terrorism and heroism. So let me begin then. With the question that, as an outsider to this society, this may not have occurred to you, but to me, when I think about meaning, I think about it as something that's about linguistics. Words have meaning, sentences, utterances have meaning. And so I wondered, what is the way in which that sense of meaning relates to the questions that we're discussing here about the meaning of a life or the meaning of life. So let's begin with the definition of meaning that might occur to you if you were to consult linguists. And let me quote a philosopher, Paul Ziff, who's much concerned with meaning, who wrote, "The significance of what is said depends on what is not said. The fact that excellent, splendid, in other words, are available and yet not employed, serves to determine what I mean when I say this is a good painting." So, to put it more generally, the meaning of a term is given by two sets of things: those with which it's associated and those with which it contrasts. So, let's take an example. What's the meaning of the word cat? Well, that's given in part by the distributive set of the word cat. What is a distributive set of the word cat? Well, that's the set of all the words that, of all the contexts in which the word cat might occur. So the blank is on the mat is part of it, but door blank lapsed wouldn't mean anything. Secondly, for each of these contexts, the word cat's meaning is determined by what else might have occurred in that same context. So you could say the dog is on the mat, but you couldn't say the please is on the mat. It wouldn't mean anything. So what's that got to do with the word meaning as it's used in this conference? Well, here's my suggestion. I want to say that the meaning of a person or an event or of a value is given by its association with all the other things in our web of meaning, and by the contrasts which in each of these cases you could make with other things that could have been in that same position. And when you think about all of those possible associations and contrasts, that generates a world of possibilities. And part of what I want to say, but I'm not going to talk much about it, but it's, as it were, presupposed, is that meaning is about the way in which we conceive of possibilities. So, for example, we often say that love, indeed I've heard it said today, that love is an extremely important producer of meaning. What does that mean? Well, it doesn't just mean that love is a good feeling. We know that it's often a bad feeling as well. I want to say that love actually is not a feeling or emotion at all. Love is a syndrome. And when I say syndrome, people might object. Indeed, a reader of my book, when it was under consideration, said, well, syndrome sounds rather medical. Yes, I endorse that connotation. But what I mean about it is that, in effect, suppose Cecily loves Ernest. That means not that Cecily is experiencing a particular emotion, but that, as a matter of fact, name any emotion you can think of. Cecily would experience that emotion in relation to Ernest in some circumstance that you can devise. You can tell a story in which the love of Cecily for Ernest would be manifested as hope, despair, agony, jealousy, joy, anything. It just depends on the story. That's what I mean by syndrome, because other emotion-like terms have a much narrower range of circumstances under which they might evoke different emotions. So in short, I want to say that love forms a pattern, a kind of web of association and contrasts, and that this is the way in which the ordinary meaning of meaning in linguistics relates to the more arcane, but for you, the most central meaning of meaning. Now, what's a web of meaning? All I want to say, it looks sort of like that, though this is intentionally illegible, which perhaps is insignificant in itself, and it's just a picture. Now, what about my three existential questions? My first existential question, I'm going to just simply list these questions and then I'm going to go into them in more detail. The first question is about our attitudes to time. The Greek sage Solon is said to have said, "Call no man happy until he is dead." Aristotle quotes this. And it means that you can't tell until a life is over whether the life is happy. Aristotle thought perhaps even after the life is over that you could call it unhappy after all if the sons and daughters of the person in question have terrible lives. So can a life find meaning only as a whole? That's my first question. Only when it is driven by some sort of overall sense of purpose Or should we, on the contrary, live in the present? That's my first question. The second is about transcendence. We often hear nowadays, especially from the right, the observation that atheists couldn't possibly be good. And indeed, the statistic is often cited that atheists are even worse than Muslims as prospective presidents of the United States, because they're the worst possible people. They couldn't possibly be trusted to be good. Now, of course, this is a religious formulation of that thesis, but it doesn't exist only in religious form. There's a secular version. There's a secular version which I'll come to when I talk about it in a minute. But the alternative here is to say that all meaning is ultimately, and perhaps here I could borrow Jordan's formulation, dependent on our interpretations, on the way in which we see the world, on our preferences, on our emotions, on our desires. That is, in fact, the Nietzschean view. There is nothing else out there which is the source of my values. And the third one, which I think perhaps is going to be the most contentious, is about suffering. Is there such a thing as inherent value in suffering? Now, Joe didn't say there was, but I have a feeling that there is somewhere in that unexplored part of his brain something of a feeling that, yes, there is an inherent value to suffering. Or is suffering just what it seems on the surface? For a superficial person like myself, that it is the very paradigm of evil. Those are my three questions. Now, I suggested that those questions give rise to answers that arrange themselves rather naturally into two packages of answers. The heavy package is this. To the first question, the answer is one should husband one's time, one should live according to an overall plan, maybe a hierarchic structure of values, such as the beautiful, presented in Jordan's beautiful diagram, where you think about being a good person, which involves being a good parent, which involves doing the right thing by your children and maybe by the community and so on, so that your whole life has, but in time, not just at the moment, a hierarchical structure. There's a book called The Purpose-Driven Life, which you might expect, though you certainly wouldn't want to read it, to present this sort of view. Or, on the contrary, I'll get into that more later. But the second answer in this package is that the source of value is transcendent in the sense that there's something absolute, objective, that doesn't depend on me, which is the source of my values. And the third answer is that suffering is inherently ennobling, that it's redemptive, that it is ultimately good in spite of appearances. That's what I call the heavy package. Now, the heavy package fits most comfortably into the Christian system of thought. But it doesn't require the Christian system of thought, as we'll see. Let me first define the light package. The light package says that we should live in the now. We should make minimal concessions to the uncertain, inevitably uncertain consequences of what we do. So we should act as best we know for the present. We should fully enjoy the pleasures available and endure what sufferings there are in the present, without always subordinating them to what there might be in the future. To the second question, the light package answers that the only source of value lies in your own emotions, in pleasure and the avoidance of pain. There is no natural or extra-human source of value. And therefore, the third answer is obvious. The idea that suffering has inherent value is not just paradoxical, it is completely nonsensical. Suffering is just the very paradigm of evil. And while it might have some sort of instrumental value in certain cases, it has no inherent value. So what do I mean when I say that these disagreements are temperamental? As I say, I don't have, there are lots of theories of personality, the Big Five and the Jungian theories of personality. There are some theories of temperament. But I'm not really talking about any of those, though I would be very interested in some research that explored the way in which people's answers to the three questions that I've posed relates to their temperament in some sense that might be defined by one of those theories. Essentially, I define it negatively. I mean that the answers that people give tend to be stable through time, that their convictions are very powerful, and that they very seldom change. And when they do, their change tends to have the form of a conversion. And what I mean by a conversion is actually rather nicely typified by people who have or wish to undergo a gender reassignment. Because such people often say that what they've done is not somehow change their mind, they've just discovered their mind, that they have discovered something was there all along. And for that reason, although each of these answers tend to be backed by reasons that people really hold dear, I think the reasons have very little to do with what people actually do answer in these cases. And the reason is that the way in which reasons function when we're thinking about meaning is not what it looks like. It looks like we're giving arguments, and I will give arguments, because that's all you can do when you consider these various questions. I'll be giving arguments, but I want you to realize that first and throughout, in case I forget to remind you, that these answers are just what I or somebody else might find the natural and obvious and convincing answers. They are not answers that truly should carry conviction from a strictly rational point of view. So they function more like the caption to a drawing. You know this drawing? What do you see? A Mexican riding a bicycle seen from on top. You didn't see it, but now you see it. I think philosophy is like that. It makes you see things in a different way, which is not arbitrary, because I couldn't have said it's a monkey climbing a fence, or it's a fish taking a bait. You would have said, huh? But when I say a Mexican or a person in a Mexican hat riding a bicycle seen from on top, you see it. That's what interpretation is like, and that's what I mean when I say that people give those answers on the basis of interpretive, temperamental predispositions. So let's look at these questions in turn. To begin with, think about our attitudes to time. Since I am an outsider to this community, I thought it might be useful to look at some of the things that appear on your network website. And I did find, on this topic in particular, some interesting articles. In fact, I found one for each of the two answers to the question about time. Professor Chen Yuxi has published on that website a very interesting article about the fascinating concept of Wu Wei, which means not, well, it's always very difficult to know exactly how to translate, but it's often translated no action, non-action, something like that. It's about somehow living naturally. And I think it's a version of living in the now. So I see this as a defense of living in the now without excessive concern for the future. Now, this concept is the key concept of both Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, who are known as Taoists. And Taoism was specifically a reaction against Confucianism. So the Confucian ideal is in fact the precise opposite. It is that you should build a life with extremely effortful exercises of your habits, constructing such habits as would enable you by the age of 70 to do whatever you want without ever doing anything wrong. Which is a nice idea, I'm still waiting. But then, of course, I don't make efforts. So, there is an article on the site which seems to me to exemplify the opposite answer. It's an article by I think it's Tara Miller, who writes a model of transcendence in the life of Brother Lawrence. Brother Lawrence is, as the title indicates, a monk who spent much of his life cooking and doing the dishes, etc., which he didn't like doing. So he didn't do it because he enjoyed it. He did it because he did it for God, because he did it as part of his pursuit of a greater and nobler aim, and of course a more distant one, being salvation. So both of these attitudes appear on your site. Now, here's a piece of Chinese support for the idea of living in the now. It's my favorite Chinese proverb. Chinese proverbs are generally, traditional Chinese proverbs have just 4 characters. This one says, the old man on the frontier lost his horse. And here's a story. The old man on the frontier has a horse and he discovers the horse is gone. Everybody comes to his house and says, oh, I'm so sorry for you, you lost your horse. And he says, well, it could be bad, but it could be good, you can't tell. Sure enough, a few days later, the horse just shows up, dragging a wild horse behind him. And people come again and say, oh, you're so lucky, how wonderful, now you have 2 horses. And he says, that could be good, could be good, could be not good. And sure enough, his son starts to break the horse, is thrown, breaks his leg, and everybody comes to his house again and commiserates. But he says, who can tell? And at the end of the story, but of course the story never ends, the army press gang comes along, takes away all the young men from the village to go to war and probable death, except the young man whose leg was broken. So to put it less metaphorically, here are some of the reasons we might have for saying live in the now. And of course, it's important to say that when we say live in the now, we don't mean live without any consideration of the past or the future. Because although now is the only time that we ever exist, it is also true that our sense of now is completely made up of our sense of our past and our future. When you read the stories of amnesics, like the unfortunate musician Robert Waring, who lost all his short-term memory, or his memory of the last few years, he is sort of trapped in a now which makes his life hell rather than bliss. So that's not what I mean by living in the now. But what I do mean is giving priority to the present rather than sacrificing the present to something future. And why should we do this? Well, part of what I think the Chinese proverb illustrates is that life is, in the purely technical sense of the word, chaotic. In the ordinary sense of the word, you might say that some lives are more chaotic than others. But in the strict technical sense, life is totally chaotic. That is to say, there is no proportionality between the importance of the causes and the importances of the effects. It's also true, derivatively, that the famous precautionary principle that one often hears about, especially from people who want you to eat organic foods and things like that, when it's never been shown that, say, genetically modified food are bad for anybody. Nevertheless, they say, you haven't proved that it's not bad for everybody. And of course, it's perfectly true that it hasn't been proved, and it's also true that if you go by the precautionary principle and don't allow yourself to genetically modify foods, you will make a few million people starve. So the precautionary principle is essentially self-defeating. And I think that in our lives, it's self-defeating as well as it is in terms of public policy. So let me move to the second, transcendence. In the Christian version, of course, it's obvious that the heavy package includes transcendence in the sense in which it is said that God is the origin of all values. As I mentioned, it's not exclusively a religious principle, because Kant, for example, believes that there is absolute moral truth which can be discovered by reason alone, and that moral truth is not reducible to what you or I might desire or prefer. Now, the thing about transcendence is that it runs into something that is known as the Euthyphro problem, from a dialogue by Plato called the Euthyphro, in which, in effect, the question is asked, supposing that you say that good is the same thing as what God commands, or what God wants or loves. The question is, does God want or love what is good because it is good, or do we just happen to call good whatever it is that God commands? Now the problem is that if you say that God wants the good because it's good, then you don't need God. God can just drop out. Just want to find out what the good is. But if good just means that it's what God commands, then we would have to accept that if God said, kill your children, which of course God does say quite often, I think it's still good. Then we just wouldn't believe it. And apart from a few diehards, most people don't think that they should, for example, kill their daughters for disobedience. They just assume that that was a mistake. Even if God said it, it would be a mistake. So, can we do without transcendence? Yes, we can do without transcendence. Now, I know that, especially in this environment, transcendence is often used simply to mean, I'm going to be better than I seem to be right now. I will transcend myself. But I mean transcendence in the literal sense. I mean transcendence in the sense that it posits some reality that is beyond the reality of everyday life. And for anybody who can't buy the idea of a supernatural reality, then it's not imaginable that anything could possibly have any value unless somebody cared. And conversely, it is enough that people should care to make certain things value. And this is, in fact, a very important research program in meta-ethics, that is to say, in the philosophy of where moral principles come from, which appeals to emotions as the ultimate source of values. So that would be a world entirely without transcendence, would be a world entirely centered on human beings and what they want and what they feel. And we don't need a transcendent domain. So now, where does meaning come from then, if it doesn't come from outside? There's sort of a school, a movement, whatever you like to call it, called inaction, or the inactivists. Very, very popular in certain circles in cognitive science. Somewhat disdained by others, because those others, including myself, think that the idea that knowledge is just for action is nothing but a biological truism. It's nothing on which you can build a new cognitive science, a different way of understanding the mind. It's just obvious. Of course it's about activity. And since we recognize that it's about activity, we might also go back to Aristotle, who defined eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, as activity of a kind that will bring out your natural capacities. As a matter of fact, I think that eudaimonia might well be translated as meaning rather than happiness, because precisely it's not a matter of how you feel, it's a matter of how your life goes. And yet, how your life goes depends on what your most fundamental talents and capacities are, and whether you thrive in their exercise. Now, Aristotle himself thought that you could answer questions about this because he thought there was such a thing as human nature. Many people believe there's such a thing as human nature. So, the way he defined what is human nature is that it had to be essential in the sense of being exclusively human and also universal among humans. Now, if you have that, then all you have to do in order to discover the meaning of life is to list those capacities that are essential to human nature, figure out how to enable people to exercise those capacities, and get on with it. Unfortunately, I submit, there is no such thing as human nature. First of all, there's nothing that is unique to humanity. We share most of our genes and most of our tendencies with other primates and other mammals. And in biology, the fundamental rule, the fundamental fact that makes evolution possible, and therefore made us possible, is diversity. The absence of clear divisions, lines, species. Species are just an abstraction, a statistical abstraction. And it means that within anything we consider a species, including a human species, there is a huge variety of capacities and of wants and needs. To be specific, Aristotle thought the final answer to his question was that the essential human capacity was doing philosophy, what he called contemplation. That's fine with me and a few other philosophers, but I know all too well that it's not everybody's cup of tea. And so any kind, I would submit that any list that you want to come up with of essential human natural traits is going to be artificial, not natural, and either universal or less than human, that is to say, not essentially human. I think we have individual natures that are the result of our temperaments, whatever those turn out to be, and that depend both on our early experience and on the genes that may, to some extent, direct our original responses to those stimuli to which we're exposed very early on. So I don't think that the concept of human nature is actually going to help us. Though I do think, and I mean that's definitely a reservation on this perhaps excessive generalization, that there are such things as human capabilities that are widely enough distributed and important enough to people's lives that they can, in an informal way, be thought of as human nature, so that people will not thrive, not only if they don't get food, if they don't get some sort of affectionate relational connections, but also if they're not able to exercise creativity, if not able to exercise autonomous choices, that sort of thing. But that's not enough to make for a human nature. So that's the negative case on the second question. Let me come to the third question, suffering. Now, there's no logical link between the question of transcendence and the question of the value of suffering. But the link is established implicitly in Tara Miller's article about Brother Orns. And I think that the value of suffering is an essentially Christian idea. In antiquity, Stoics, Buddhists, many other people thought a lot about suffering, inevitably. But the idea was that, yes, sometimes suffering was required in order to expiate guilt, for example. Or, in the case of Buddhism, the idea was that you should avoid suffering by avoiding desires, because desire is the cause of all suffering. None of these imply that suffering is ever good. On the contrary, the main thing you can do with suffering is try and avoid it for yourself and others. The pursuit, the goal, is something like detachment, ataraxia, apatheia, the absence of passions and the undisturbed mind. It's the absence of suffering, because suffering is bad. So Oedipus may have felt he had to put his eyes out, but that was, as it were, the result of something terrible, which is itself terrible. It doesn't make it good. It's the Christians that gave this a twist. The twist is that for Christianity, expiation doesn't just make suffering necessary in some way under the rules of morality. It makes it inherently good. That's, I think, a completely novel idea. I'm not a historian, I might be wrong, but I don't know of any place where suffering is inherently good except in Christianity. The Christian is expected, not like the Stoic, to somehow avoid suffering and endure it if he can't, but actually to pursue suffering and to rejoice in it. I'm not making this word up. And here I have our president, Paul Wong, to thank for a fascinating article about John Paul II. John Paul II wrote an apostolic letter called Salvifici Doloris about the saving power, the redeeming power of suffering. And he extols suffering as the essentially meaningful Christian experience. And this is a quote from John Paul II. Suffering seems to belong to man's transcendence. It is, and this is transcendence used as in this other way that I said I don't necessarily have any objection to, but it also, of course, signifies transcendence in the way I do mean it here. It is one of those points in which man is, in a certain sense, destined to go beyond himself, and he is called to this in a mysterious way. And Paul's summary of this is that suffering has meaning and dignity because of its redemptive power and spiritual significance in the context of the sacrifice and passion of Christ. And I think this is absolutely right. But I'm going to explain it by giving you a potted version of my view of the way it works in Christianity, which is perhaps more simplistic than is Jordan's. Here's the story. This is Christianity's founding and defining myth. To begin with, God entraps two innocent creatures into disobedience. Their sin is motivated by the desire to acquire knowledge. What knowledge? Knowledge of right and wrong. You would think that knowledge of right and wrong would be presupposed by the order not to do something wrong. God then punishes them, not just them, but the entire human race. Then God kind of has a change of his immutable mind and says, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to become human and get myself tortured to death. That will redeem these poor people that I have so unjustly punished for what they never did do. Now, does this redemption amount to removing the curse of suffering? No. On the contrary. Christians suffer all the more. The difference is that it's now become essential to the nature of man, says John Paul. And we continue to suffer just as much as before, but now we're supposed to rejoice in it. We are supposed to enjoy it. This is the essence of Christian masochism. Or I should say, masochistic Christianity. And the way that John Paul puts it is that we rejoice in it because we want to be like the apostle who rejoices in it because of all those whom it can help, just as it helped him to understand the salvific meaning of suffering. Now, you might have some small theological quibbles with my theology, but basically, this is the story. You cannot deny it. And although I claim it is a Christian gift, this dolorism, this idea that suffering is a good thing in itself, has infected the whole culture. I myself, I must confess, am a philosophical manic depressive. As a philosopher, I want to see things as they truly are. There is evidence that, as a matter of fact, when you're depressed, you see things more accurately. So when I'm depressed, I feel, now at least I'm seeing the world as it really is, which cheers me up, which, of course, depresses me. And so on. But even Nietzsche professes that what does not kill you makes you stronger, a saying that is often repeated and is, if you'll pardon the expression, complete, use the technical word, crap. Because the truth is that there's lots of psychological research on this topic, and it shows that, as a rule, suffering doesn't make you stronger, it makes you weaker, just like you'd expect. Of course, if you go through a hard time and you come out like one of Kathy Gilden's heroes, yes, you'll be stronger, but that was because you were stronger in the first place, as far as I can see. The Pope stresses that an act of faith is required in order to overcome quote, the sense of the uselessness of suffering, something very strongly rooted in human suffering. Yes, of course it's strongly rooted, because it is useless, and that's the correct view. What's more, faith is, as we know, a gift of grace, which really is cruelly unfair, because it basically means that you need a gift in the first place to have the faith to realize that your suffering is something you should be enjoying. Now, there are other arguments given in favor of suffering. One of them is the argument about compassion. That is also in the apostolic letter. There's the idea that suffering makes you more likely to be compassionate. That's a good thing. But when you think about it, if the sufferer is doing what she should be doing, which is rejoicing in her suffering, what is there to be compassionate about? And in any case, even if that were true, that just makes it an instrumental use of suffering. It doesn't give it any intrinsic value. Another argument that's often heard is the contrast argument. And I think I heard shadows of it today, though I can't remember when. Pleasure and joy can only be experienced against the contrasting background of pain. After all, I said myself, I opened today by saying that meaning was all about contrast. So excruciating suffering is what makes extreme bliss possible. Now, I think that that argument is manifestly fallacious, because there's plenty of contrast between pleasure and a neutral state, or a state of boredom, or a state perhaps of mild discomfort. So if God really had our interests at heart in this way, yes, he would have provided mild discomfort and maybe pain in order for us to have a better insight into what we should avoid. But that's not necessary in order to experience pleasure. So that argument doesn't go anywhere either. On the other hand, there's always the placebo effect. And as far as I can see, that's what Jordan was advocating. He was saying if you can construe things in such a way as to think that it is a good thing, then you've already gone a good part of the way towards making it a good thing. And I think that's perfectly correct. But it can also, if you're going to take that utilitarian point of view, be very bad. Very bad for other people, not just you. Mother Teresa is a good case in point. Now a saint, and a saint of whom it was said, surely, truly, there's plenty of evidence for this, that caring for the sick, for her, consisted in glorifying their suffering, not in relieving it. She was not at all interested in relieving people's suffering. Notoriously, her place in Calcutta was just hopeless about relieving suffering, and she didn't care, because she thought these people's suffering was inherently valuable. I submit that there's plenty of opportunity for meaning without making suffering an essential mode of it. Now let me end with a few remarks about heroes and terrorists. There's a famous story told by Jean-Paul Sartre about a young man who came to see him and said, should I live with my mother and look after her, she's all alone, or should I join the resistance? And Sartre notoriously said, if you didn't already know what you were going to do, you wouldn't have come to ask me, which is kind of an ambiguous remark. But the point is, the really important point is that given the uncertainty, the chaotic nature of our lives that I mentioned before, there just is no answer that one could give to that question that would be a rational answer based on acceptable principles. And it's certainly true that in one case he might have ended up a hero. He might also have ended up a terrorist, blowing up maybe convoys including German civilians, or even convoys including French prisoners of war. But the heroism and terrorism dimension is something of a continuum. And as I said this morning, I mentioned Scott Atran, who wrote that although it's a frequently heard view that the attacks of terrorists are nihilist actions by detached individuals who simply want to wreck society, certainly that could happen. This assumption ignores growing evidence that attacks like what occurred in Nice are almost always perceived by those who carry them out and who admire them as acts of personal redemption and collective salvation in the service of world revolution. So is it just that we agree with some people and we don't agree with others, and they're heroes if we agree and terrorists if we don't? No. I suggest that my classification of these answers into heavy and light has a bearing on this. I want to say that a heavy might be a hero and might be a terrorist, but a light might be a hero too, but couldn't ever be a terrorist. Because if you're light, you'll realize that actually life doesn't matter all that much. But that means your own life doesn't matter all that much. And the causes you believe in probably don't matter as much as other people's lives. Irony is the recognition, and this, I think, the thought comes from Rorty, it's not a quotation, but it's a recognition of the essential contingencies of our own convictions and of our values. So I want to say you can imagine a hero with a sense of irony, but you can't imagine an ironic terrorist. So, in short, it might be another reason to prefer the light package, that it's compatible with heroism, but not with terrorism. So, let me conclude. I began with an analogy with the semantic meaning of meaning. And I suggested that in the web of our life, the connectivity and overall integration of our concerns is what forms the pattern of our life that is meaningful, or if it is impoverished or lacking in some crucial concerns that relate to our individual nature, meaningless. And I suggested that our deepest existential commitments on these three sample existential questions is not something that could be determined by rational argument. We have three existential choices on time, on transcendence, and on suffering. For each, there are two possible answers, though not obviously ones that you're compelled to take entirely on one side or the other. These are obviously types. And the typical packages, I suggested you could call them heavy and light. And they yield three undecidable oppositions. And by that I mean rationally undecidable, but not that you haven't decided on, because I suspect that each one of you will have one answer or the other available to yourself if you ask yourself those questions. Living for now or living for a greater purpose? Find meaning in human or in transcendent sources? View suffering as inherently good or absolutely bad? The heavy, I believe, is in our culture the default. Our lives must make sense as a whole, even if that's to the detriment of our momentary satisfactions. And we can quench the thirst for meaning only by drawing on the supposed designs of some greater but fundamentally alien being, such as God, or as a moral order. And ultimately, meaning can be attained only at the cost of suffering. That's the heavy package. Against the default heavy package. Our lives are lived in moments. And that's what we should strive to increase the intrinsic value of, every moment that we live. That meaning that we find in moments is one we need no transcendent source to justify. And suffering destroys rather than ever creating meaning. Rather than building links, it narrows attention away from everything but itself. It makes us concentrate just on suffering. Even if the way you concentrate on it is to say, ooh, that's good, I'm suffering. Must be a good Christian. So meaning, I want to say, properly understood, is actually an aesthetic property that's formed by the patterns of our lives, that is to say, the patterns of desires, emotions, intentions, and the connection or connections that we have with those that we love. Thank you. Anything that cognitive science that doesn't, as it were, wear that label doesn't recognize. The fact that knowledge is